Good morning, everyone. I'm Ellen Hannock. I'm a senior fellow with PPIC, working on environmental issues. And I'm hoping everybody can get their seats now so we can get started with this next exciting session. We've got a hot topic for you. Education is a really important topic, obviously, but climate change has been on a lot of people's minds in California for some time now, and this panel, really outstanding panel, is going to be addressing that. Before I give you a little bit of introduction, I just want to give another plug for participating in the videos that are being done. Actually, what's already been videoed is already up on our website. So if you go to ppic.org, not during this panel, but during your breaks, you can do that, and click on the YouTube icon. You can see yourself and your friends on TV. So, climate change. This is one of those areas where California has drawn attention in a somewhat different way from the dysfunction that we often hear about in the national news about our budget and our education system and other things. California really stands out as a global leader when it comes to climate change. In 2004, the state adopted the nation's first greenhouse gas emissions targets for passenger vehicles, and then 2 years later, it passed the landmark Global Warming Solutions Act to reduce emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. Since then, the state has approved landmark laws and regulations in a range of areas, including cutting passenger vehicle use, increasing renewable energy, producing cleaner gasoline, and creating a market-based structure to price carbon. Clearly, if you look at the public opinion polling and at voter behavior, it's clear that California is a green state. Polls consistently show strong public support for ambitious response to climate change, and if there was any doubt, voters reaffirmed their commitment last month when they rejected Proposition 23, which would have suspended climate change efforts during the economic downturn. Despite the state's past resolve, however, the course ahead remains uncertain. And there are several factors in this. One is that at the federal level, major legislation on climate change appears to have stalled for the near future. So this leaves California without the possibility of linking to federal actions. And here in California, the slow economic recovery and the substantial budget deficit may temper the state's own ability to move quickly. Finally, there are still sharp partisan differences within the electorate and conflicts between major interest groups on this issue. The conflicts portend a contentious and litigious path ahead as climate change policies begin to take effect. Meanwhile, as a background to all of this on the policy front, it's important to note that evidence continues to point to a planet that is warming rapidly enough to generate extreme weather events, threaten ecosystems, raise the level of the oceans, and so on, with many effects for California and for other parts of the world. And it's clear that major change will be required at the global level, not just in California, to reverse the current trends of rising greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to lead this panel, we have a really excellent moderator and someone who's very knowledgeable himself on this topic, Stuart Leavenworth, who is an editorial page editor at the Sacramento Bee. He oversees the Bee's daily opinion pages and its California Forum section on Sundays. Stu is a native of Fresno, and he's been working in newspapers for more than 25 years, including papers not just in California but also in Japan, in Louisiana, Georgia, and North Carolina. He joined the Bee in 1999, and for the first 5 years he covered a range of subject matter topics including natural resources, energy, transportation, and housing. And then in 2004 he joined the editorial board, specializing in commentary on the governor and on state government issues. And I want to also add a little personal plug that I was especially impressed by. I work on water, and Stu is an award-winning writer, author of a series in the Sac Bee on the flood risk for this region, which is something that actually is going to be more pressing with climate change and some of the changes in the snowpack in California. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Stu and ask you to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you. So, as an editorial page editor, it's kind of an unusual position for me to be a moderator. My job is usually to be the antagonist, but I told PPIC I'd try to behave myself. We have a really interesting panel here. One of the people that I've been known to antagonize is sitting here to my right, Susan Kennedy, the Chief of Staff for Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. And Susan, I'm really glad you could join this panel with your background on the PUC and being in the midst of AB 32 issues. I know that you'll offer some really interesting insights as we delve into this.
I wouldn't miss the opportunity to take you on in person.
You know, one of the delights of my job is getting an email from Susan Kennedy at like 12:01 in the morning, as soon as our editorial hits the website. So she's a very fast writer. Sitting next to Susan is Jack Stewart, who's president of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. Jack, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Stu.
On the far end here is Ted Craver, who's chairman, president, CEO of Edison International. Thanks, Ted.
Good to be here, Stu.
And sitting next to Ted is Rebecca Shaw, Associate State Director of Conservation for the Nature Conservancy. Rebecca has expertise in the whole issue of impacts and adaptation to climate change. So thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
So when AB 32 was enacted and signed by the governor, is a much different time. Different economy. There was a presumption that although California was the leader in this area, that there would be a federal policy that would quickly become behind it. Obviously, things are very different now. Different economy, different situation in Washington. So I wanted to start our discussion with the obvious question. Given our economy, given what's going on in Washington, how should California proceed given its fiscal issues and given the strong public support for AB 32 that was demonstrated by the rejection of Proposition 23? Susan, I'd like to start with you on that question.
I think it's really simple. Even in the best economy times, even in the worst political times, you would want to move ahead with major policies like AB 32 and not subject it to the vicissitudes of economic or political changes. You cannot transform a policy as impactful as our energy policy or climate change policy and expect to pull it back or push ahead based upon whether or not you're in a recession or whether or not you have political changes in Washington. Every decade, we go through one or two contractions. Every decade, we go through one or two political upheavals. The reason that I think the United States has had such a difficult time compared to some other countries in terms of our energy policy is because of the inconsistency, because we knee-jerk. And so I would say, without question, it should be a very confident, full speed ahead with the knowledge that anytime you're making this kind of a transformation, you have to do it with a sensitivity to the economic impact. You would have to implement the policy in a way that it can be digested in the economy.
So regarding the lack of a federal policy for the near future, how does that change things, or does it change things in how the state should implement AB 32?
Well, I think it makes it harder in some ways to implement the type of policies such as any kind of a cap and trade system. Clearly, the larger the market, the more effective a cap and trade system would be, and the lack of a national or international framework for that makes it very difficult. But the 80% of our climate change policy is not about cap and trade. It's about energy efficiency. It's about investment in solar. It's about energy security. And there's 16, 17 states in the U.S. that already have renewable portfolio standards. So there is a regional, if not a national, market for renewable energy, and there's an international market for renewable energy that is changing the economies of scale for investment in renewables, and that's the underpinning of really the climate change policies. The low carbon fuel standard, these are policies that don't need a national energy policy in order to function, but they would function better in the framework of a national policy.
Mm-hmm. Jack, the industries that you represent have an enormous stake in the implementation of AB 32. How do you think California should proceed given that Prop 23 was rejected by voters, Given that we have a new governor in office, how do you think California should proceed?
I think we need to do a go slow implementation of AB 32, and I disagree with Susan on that. I think we were at the very bottom of one of the worst economic recessions we've had in a very long time, with 12.4% or 12.2% unemployment in California. The question is can we implement and impose the most aggressive, most complex regime of regulations on California industry that we've ever imposed that will result in higher costs for energy, which is a direct cost of doing business, and it stands to hurt the individuals who are working for my companies, the companies I represent. That I think it's very difficult to do this right now when we're trying to claw our way out of this recession slowly, but we're not seeing the job growth. And I think in economic terms, what's happened in manufacturing and industry in California is as costs go up, regulatory costs go up, the cost of taxes go up, all the things that impact the price of manufacturing, the only place for a manufacturer to contract is on the human resource side. I mean, everything else has to be paid or you're closed down. So what's happened is over the last decade, we've lost a third of our industrial workforce in California, and most of that actually before the current recession. It was an alarming trend, and what's happening is we're seeing jobs that were wealth creators, sectors that were wealth creating sectors of our economy shrinking while we're increasing the service sector, which does not create wealth, and the result of that is lower wages for all Californians and fewer middle class jobs. The real pressure right now is on the middle class of California. Having a growing, vibrant middle class really rests on having a vibrant, growing wealth creation sector of our economy. And that's the sectors of the economy that have been hurt most in the current recession and with the high cost of doing business in California. And certainly looking forward to the implementation of AB 32, we just see those costs increasing.
So you say go slow. What does that mean?
Well, my recommendation would be is to take a look. We've talked a lot about having a clean economy, cleaning up our environment, and you can have a good economy at the same time. Let's figure out what that really means as far as creating jobs in California. I would suggest, a time out on this, maybe a year to catch our breaths on this, and then look at how we integrate new environmental regulations into our economy. 30 years ago, we started doing environmental regulations in California, and they were actually ripples hitting up against a very strong and vibrant industrial sector that could absorb those costs. As we've gone over the years with more and more regulatory agencies and more legislation coming out of the Capitol, what's happening is we're just seeing a tsunami of new regulations coming from every direction, and it's very difficult for a manufacturer who has to absorb those costs, either the implementation costs or the permitting costs, to absorb those costs and continue to be successful in this state. And what it's doing is it creates a great deal of uncertainty in the business climate. And if you're a manufacturer and you are planning on investing in plant and equipment, you don't invest for the next year or two. You're looking out 10, 15 years to make that investment work. Well, if in California right now, with this uncertainty in the regulatory climate of California, it's very difficult to get an investor to make a decision to invest here. We still are a great innovative state. We're seeing a lot of innovation happening here. But when those innovative products come to market and they need to be scaled up to production, what's happening is they're going someplace else, China or another state, and then we're marketing those back into California. So we're getting the innovation side, which is great, and we're getting the marketing side. We're buying the products back, the green products back, but we're really not getting the benefits of the wealth creation and middle class jobs.
Yeah. So we'll come back to the issues, the economic impacts, but I wanted to ask Rebecca, you represent a group that also has a huge stake in the outcome of AB 32. The Nature Conservancy is dedicated to protecting natural habitats not only here in California but around the world. What do you think California should do? How should it proceed in implementing AB 32?
Well, I really, as we heard last night at the panel last night, if anybody's counting on new government money to implement these things right now, you're going to be disappointed. We heard that last night from Mac Taylor. And I think you also recognize where we are today in California and really take note of that before we start moving forward. Every initiative on the 2010 ballot associated with government went down to defeat because the trust in government is at an all-time low. Except, of course, Prop 22, which supported local government over state government. And I just want to point out that the Nature Conservancy knows this all too well, because we were principal backers of Prop 21, the initiative that would have assessed $18 vehicle license fee to support state parks. And although the polling showed right up until the election that there was broad support for Prop 21, the gap widened as we got closer, and anything having to do with government and new fees went down to defeat. So no matter how supportive the electorate was of state parks, and they are really supportive of state parks, highest name recognition, very supportive of the kind of services that state parks gives to Californians, it still went down to defeat. So what does this mean for climate change policy? If you can't pass a simple, an initiative that supports state parks where there's tangible benefits to Californians, how can you continue to implement AB 32 and also begin to spend resources to help adapt to climate change impacts? So I say, I don't have an answer about AB 32. It's very important, because it doesn't actually matter what we do. No matter what we do, we're going to feel the impacts. We need to take measures, take stock of where Californians are today, and continue to implement AB 32 in a responsible and measured way. On the other side of it, though, we really do need to understand that even with the implementation of AB 32, the stall in any sort of international or national policy on greenhouse gas emissions reduction means that we have committed ourselves to significant climate change impacts that will impact all of us. Global temperatures have already begun to rise, as you all know, bringing with them increases in intensity and frequencies of storms, floods, wildfires, all things that are critically important in California, and also sea level rise. During this century, the trends are expect to intensify, causing harm to our local communities and to our natural resources, and also threatening our water supply. And these impacts of climate change will be felt in communities across California, requiring local governments to react and respond to secure health and the safety of the citizens of California. But there is a significant gap, even now, today, in the ability of planners and decision makers at the local scales to interpret and evaluate climate risk information. It's essential for effective adaptation planning, because again, no matter what we do today, AB 32 is critically important. It's critically important that California continue to be a leader on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We need to help our local communities begin to understand what the impacts of climate change will be and begin to plan for those and plan for the adaptation to those impacts to secure health and safety. Even without the resources, many local communities are already starting to take action around the state and develop adaptation plans. And explicitly in the websites, it will say adaptation plans. They are doing climate change adaptation planning, including the city of Chula Vista, the city of Sacramento, and the 9-county Bay Area. And I know there are many others as more and more of these websites on climate change adaptation begin to pop up. They recognize that that not planning for, but instead waiting and reacting to the impacts of climate change will be more costly in the long term. And so they are taking planning efforts to identify cost-effective decisions that they can make today to help them adapt to climate change in the future. And so, what I ask in all this is what can the state of California do to help the local communities that are taking leadership and taking the initiative on adaptation planning? And again, last night, the message was loud and clear. If we're counting on money from the state of California to make things happen, we're going to wait for a little while for that. So, but we also heard that there are opportunities to begin to realign the relationship between state government and local governments, and provide local governments the flexibility and the incentives they need and the information they need to plan well. It's an opportunity to think anew about how to support local and regional entities to plan for the impacts of climate change, and the communities to plan through existing planning efforts, including the implementation of SB 375. I was on a...
I was just going to say, it's interesting what you're saying. So much of the focus to date has been on the Air Resources Board and its rather, shall we say, convoluted implementation of all these regulations and things that, that surround AB 32. But you're suggesting that the state could play a really important role in helping local governments facilitate programs that would both reduce emissions and also help them adapt to the changes that are coming as the climate warms.
That's right, and I think that you can do a lot. I mean, again, local communities are doing a lot with little resources on this and adaptation, and I do think that the state of California can help those local governments by providing the right incentives and the right information on risk to really begin the adaptation process, and in doing so, increase the accessibility of the information about the risks of climate change. That's also creating a more informed citizenry for support of AB 32 in the future.
So we'll come back to this issue, but I wanted to ask Ted, we're sitting here in a room with lights on right now,
thankfully,
rather bright light. So obviously electricity is essential to everything we do here in California. What are some of the things that you think Californians should be thinking about as we go ahead and try to implement AB 32?
I guess in a word I would say carefully, maybe even cautiously. But I think we're very much on the side that we should go forward. The key point though, when you really think about it, we're operating as an example, probably an example to the nation, maybe even to the world with our implementation of AB 32. And I think it's a fantastic opportunity. It's one that we really want to fully embrace, but above all, it must be successful. It's a little bit of be careful what you wish for. I think the vote was a landmark vote. Need to be a little careful about reading too much into the vote. The bill hasn't arrived yet. So this is more, at this point, we're talking about future events, future concepts, future implementation without a really good set of facts around what the costs are associated with this. So I think that's one part in the implementation. We have to be thoughtful about what are the trade-offs and what are the costs associated with it. And many of those we just don't know yet. So I would say recognize we're an example, recognize we have the opportunity to be a good example or be a disastrous example. And the reason I say the last word is, oddly enough, my first day on the job at Edison, John Bryson brought me in, was the day that Governor Wilson signed AB 1890, the deregulation bill. And it's important to recognize that was fully supported by the legislature, unanimous votes. And there were many, I think, landmark elements to that bill, many good, but in the implementation, something got missed. At least as I view it, it's less about whether it was a good concept or not. It was more about how it got implemented. We're all prisoners of our own history. That's my history. So I was, in fact, the CFO during the period of time when we were in an energy crisis. And the company was, for all intents and purposes, insolvent. So I think we want to be very careful. Certainly at Edison, we want to see the cap and trade element. I think Susan may have mentioned that was about 20% of the emissions reductions out of AB 32. So it's not the majority, but it's the area that's the most complex, perhaps. And that's an area we really want to proceed carefully, thoughtfully, so that at the end we have a good example of what can be done in climate change, as opposed to an example that all the naysayers will point to.
Well, the premise of any climate change strategy is to put a price on carbon, right? Because the source of so many emissions is cheap energy, cheap carbon going into the atmosphere. So from your perspective, what is the way for the state to implement AB 32 so that it puts a price on carbon, but doesn't vastly increase electricity rates or have some other impact on our economy.
We spent a lot of time on this during the national debate. Edison International was an active supporter of Waxman-Markey, not particularly the most popular position these days nationally, but largely because we thought that it would move us towards that process of putting a price on carbon that would allow economic choices to be made. But it also had embedded in it some important concepts of crawl before you walk, walk before you run. You have to really work out the bugs when you're putting something as complex and as comprehensive as that in. So I think the broader element here is you do want to get to that end goal so that good economic choices can be made, and it incorporates the full costs, social costs as well as costs of productions, into the decision making. But again, it has to be done in a very thoughtful way. These are unbelievably complex markets, as we learned, and there are some unique features of electricity that are really not in any other commodity market.
So what would you think if California had a cap and trade system for electricity emissions just in California?
Well, just to be frank, I think it's going to be expensive. California is already a relatively low emitting state. We really don't have any coal plants. We have virtually no petroleum fired generation anymore. Everything's natural gas or renewables or nuclear. So it's a very low emitting state as it sits right now for electricity production. I'm not talking about transportation. As a result, getting reductions, further reductions in carbon emissions from a sector that's already low in emissions naturally means the unit cost, the cost per ton emitted is going to be relatively high compared to other places. So if you were to put Ohio side by side, not to pick on Ohio, but to put one of those states side by side with California, it's much cheaper on a per unit basis to get carbon emission reductions out of the states that are higher emitting states. So we have to understand that we will be a relatively high cost state to implement something like cap and trade, where you're putting an explicit value on the price of carbon. That means that headline number is going to be used by a lot of people around the country and around the world to say, look at that, that's the cost that comes from putting a price on carbon. So I think we have to be thoughtful about that. Again, we want this to be a good example, not one that people can use to really denigrate the whole effort of climate change.
Yeah. So Susan, you served on the PUC. You have some pretty intimate knowledge of electricity prices and the challenges that the state faces in being competitive with other states. Can California implement AB 32 and a cap and trade system and keep its electricity prices at a level that will allow us to remain competitive with other states?
Yes, I think we can. And I need to start out by saying I agree with everything Mr. Craver just said. He's absolutely right. California's electricity sector is one of the cleanest and most efficient in the world, and comparatively. And so focusing on that sector when it comes to implementing any kind of a cap and trade where there's a price on carbon is going to be very difficult and expensive in the electricity sector. Without a national framework or an international framework, it will force us to start out at a very, very low cost, at a very high allocated system, in order to not have any kind of a rate shock in that sector. So he's absolutely right. It will take longer to implement any kind of a cap and trade system where there's a price on carbon into the sectors, the transportation sector and other sectors of our manufacturing, where there's a lot more room. But again, if you're not part of a national market, it's going to force us to go even much, much slower and a much, much lower slower ramp up in order to make it work. But I think you have to look at this we're asking the wrong question to some degree. I mean, 10 years ago, when we were in the middle of the electricity crisis, the most important thing was energy security. We were throwing money at peaker plants that didn't matter what they were using to generate electricity as long as we kept the lights on. And it was like, that was the number one most important thing 10 years ago. 5 years ago, environmental policy was the issue of the day, and everything was about climate change. And we passed, during the electricity crisis, we passed dozens and dozens and dozens, I would like to say closer to 50 to 75 different laws that mandated all sorts of answers to the electricity crisis, which he has to deal with today. And every single one of those, whether it's community choice aggregation or transmission or the solar mandates, all the different mandates pushes up the per kilowatt cost for the electricity we're using today. 5 years ago, we shifted our focus to the environmental policy, and climate change was the big issue. And so we've had regulation after regulation after regulation to try and build up our, the climate change portfolio. And today, in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, cost is the most important thing. But in any kind of a policy, with the question you're trying to answer, you have to balance all three. We have to balance energy security, our environmental policy, and cost at the same time. And we have never gone back and taken a look at how do you integrate all of these different policies so that you are developing a least cost, best fit approach to our energy policy. That's the question you have to answer before you can answer the question of, can we implement AB 32 in a cost-effective way so we're not outpricing other states? Absolutely we can, but we have to take an integrated approach to our policy making. The manufacturing sector is a good proxy for how badly we have done this. We're one of the most energy efficient states in the world. 50%. The rest of the country has increased their per capita energy usage, 50% higher than what California has. But our per kilowatt energy costs are higher than other states. So tens of billions of dollars that we're not spending on energy is in our economy and has stayed in our economy, which is a good thing in California. But our per kilowatt cost really affects the manufacturing industry, the very high energy intensive manufacturing. And so I don't think there's ever going to be a good time for the manufacturing industry for us to implement AB 32. I wanted to go back and challenge something that Jack said, because a 12-month delay is not going to make any difference for your folks. It's about the per kilowatt cost of electricity, period, end of story. And so the only way that we can implement AB 32 and stay competitive, with him being the proxy for that with other states, is if we very carefully go back and look through all of the conflicting and pancaked regulations that we have on a sector like the electricity sector and try and get the per kilowatt cost down as low as it can be. We never go back and challenge that, because he's always going to be hurting, and we're never going to be able to implement it and stay competitive until we do that.
Jack, do you agree with Susan?
Well, I do agree with her. We are in California, our industrial electricity rates are 50% higher than the average of the rest of the nation. So that puts an immediate disadvantage on manufacturing in California. And I couldn't agree more that we need to go back and disassemble some of these regulations that have been thrown upon us. That's why I suggest maybe a year, take a breath, go back and look at all those regulations, see if there's something we can do about that, see if there's a will to do that, to help balance off the economic recovery that we really need, rather than implement new costs on top of what's already there. And that's what's happened. It's just been layer after layer of new costs going on to the businesses of California. Our suggestion is we go back and try to see if we can't figure out a way to make this all work and to disassemble some of those costs that are on there that really probably could be done away with.
But I would say you're absolutely right, except a delay. Name one regulation in AB 32 that is going into effect in the next 12 months that would affect your per kilowatt cost.
Well, the nothing in regulation. I mean, there are other.
That's my point.
Well,
I mean,
there are not only, but it's not only the regulation. It's the other statutes
exactly.
and other regulations that are there. I mean, the PUC has its energy efficiency rules. We have other efficiency rules that have been put on by the legislature.
You're absolutely right, and I'm trying to agree with you.
Yes.
But what I'm saying is that this knee-jerk idea that a 12-month delay in AB 32 is somehow needed, it's not. And that's the exact consistency that we cannot just put regulations in place and then suspend them for 12 months and then put them back in place and suspend them for 12 months. That's how you blow investment. And we're actually getting really good investment in this sector. It does not take away the urgent need for us to look at all of the regulations that are pancaked, that are affecting him, and therefore affecting you.
But my contention is you need to do that at this time when there's a crisis and there's the willingness to do that. We just lay on this new set of regulations, and then don't get to the disassembling of previous regulations. I mean, what's the incentive to do it? I mean, if we have incentive from both sides, we have the high costs, we're looking at the high costs. The environmental community is looking at how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Doesn't it make sense that we should, say, let's take a breath on this? I mean, I think with the world economy and the fact that the federal government and whatever's going on down in Cancun is not going to produce very much, that takes a little bit of the urgency off of California to move quickly on this. So I think that what we need to do is figure out how we're going to do this in a sound economic way. And really, I think part of this is to develop a structure within California, an independent audit authority, to really look at what the cost of new regulations are, so that we know that before we suffer high cost and job loss as unintended consequences of good ideas. I mean, do I believe we're going to get to energy efficiency and clean energy at some point in our future? Yes, in my lifetime, probably not. I mean, the world's still 87% dependent on fossil fuel for energy. But I couldn't agree more that we need to start reducing the amount of fossil fuel we use to create energy. But the success of the global economy, of our national economy, has been the availability of low-cost energy. And I just don't think that we can trade off that low cost for greenhouse gas reductions and not hurt the economy. Yeah. We need a go slow approach, so we get this right. And as Ted said, if we get this wrong, it's going to set the whole world back on cleaning up our emissions.
And I would just say we are going slow. We are taking a very go slow approach, in my view, and rightfully so. I think he's right. But I think that the urgency. It's a mistake to waste energy on wanting to do a cost analysis of each new regulation, because a cost analysis, you're just kind of dueling cost analysis. If there is a will to make it easier to build in this state, if there is a will to try and reduce our per kilowatt energy costs so that we are competitive, you don't need these rifle shot approaches to try and slow down this or do a cost study on that. There hasn't been the will.
I think to me, that's one of the key. Hope I'm not doing your job here, Stuart. But that's one of the key issues that I think we grapple with is the will means, I believe, that people have to be educated with the facts. I mean, there is an emotional element here, which is important. You need that in order to drive forward, but you also need to inform the public around the facts. And I really do worry that we have not done a thorough job of informing the public about what the choices are. You used a word, Susan, to me is a critical word, and that's the balance point. And I think for most people, if you can explain it in reasonable terms, they understand that most everything in life is a trade-off. You're not going to just be able to maximize one variable and world will be great. You have to trade things off. And I'm not sure that people are entirely cognizant of either the adaptation trade-off issues and costs, the costs of implementing some of these things, the costs of changing some of the behaviors, such as energy efficiency, that need to be done. And I really believe that's something that public policymakers, business leaders, NGOs, all of us need to do a better job of, particularly in the climate change discussion. We get on kind of political rhetoric as opposed to explaining to people what their real trade-offs are.
So, Ted, in your opening statement, you called AB 32 a fantastic opportunity. Can you expand on that a little bit more? What are the potential benefits for California in implementing AB 32, economically and otherwise?
Yeah. I think the fantastic opportunity is to do it well. And at least in most things we do in our business, you have an aspiration. Mm-hmm. You want to accomplish things. You set out a plan for how you're going to accomplish those things. You set up metrics for determining whether you're on the right path, whether you're succeeding in the aspiration. And you do a lot of check and adjust because not every plan is going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. I think this is the same type of process. If anything, much larger stakes. just one element of this, the renewables part that Susan mentioned, which I think is a hallmark element, that has a lot of job creation opportunity in it. It has a tremendous opportunity for innovation. And with innovation, you don't know where that's going to take you. That's going to take you in so many different ways, so many different places, all of which are fantastic opportunities. And at least for my money, that's the spirit that kind of is embodied in California, that innovative, on the edge type of spirit. So I think those are the types of opportunities that are there. But again, I keep going back to the central theme. It has to be implemented well with some opportunities to do some check and adjust if things are either getting too expensive or getting off track too fast. Those types of adjustments need to be incorporated.
So what you're saying is we could be a model, perhaps. We could come up with a strategy for reducing emissions that potentially could be the framework for a national policy?
We are that. We are that model. I mean, we're moving, so we are the model and we are the example. RGGI exists in New England. It's not as comprehensive as AB 32. Again, the cap and trade element is almost a smaller point of the entire fabric of AB 32. So there are a lot of other components that I think will have very tangible results. I haven't seen, I guess I'll say, a good mechanism for determining along the hierarchy which are the most efficient things to implement, which are the kind of quicker hits that we could do sooner. And some of that may not even be very allowable inside the existing legislation, but in a lot of the regulation that will follow to implement it, I believe there are some opportunities to be thoughtful about what do we do first, what comes second, and be particularly careful about overcomplicating the implementation. That's the death of these things.
So Rebecca, I'm going to put you on the spot. Playing devil's advocate, why should California have its own policy on reducing greenhouse gas emissions? I mean, we are just a very small percentage of the overall world emissions that are contributing to global climate change. Why does it make any sense for California to have a go-it-alone policy?
You know, I think California always has had somewhat of a go-it-alone policy on a lot of issues, not just related to the environment, but certainly innovation in other arenas as well. And we have a position on the world stage as the 8th largest economy. I saw in the AP report last week that we are the 8th largest economy still, even with the economic downturn. And as such, we have the opportunity, because we care about our state, we care about our economy, we care about our natural resources and our environment, we have the opportunity to set the lead and have others follow. And I think we're doing that. In the Governor's Climate Summit 3 weeks ago, they announced the R20, which is 20 regional, 20 subnational governments getting together to begin to move forward on greenhouse gas emissions policies and agreements in the absence of any sort of national movement or international framework for greenhouse gas emissions. That's largely due to the governor's leadership. He had the first Governor's Climate Summit 3 years ago, which began to bring together subnational leaders from around the world to focus on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It led to some agreements and MOUs that now carry forward, and I think that's where the real movement is going to be moving forward. So California has established itself as a leader, not just by enacting policies such as AB 32, SB 375, but also by being the first in the door and really bringing others along. And I think for California to give up on that leadership position at this point in time would be very regrettable for the planet and for the future of humanity. I mean, I think we have a special responsibility, but we have a position on in the world stage right now that I think is unsurpassed by any other entity.
Mm-hmm. So Susan, although cap and trade is just part of AB 32, it is the part that gets a lot of attention. And there's been quite a bit of debate within the environmental business community on how cap and trade should be implemented. the big question is on allowances. Should they be given away? Should there be a price set on allowances? Some say that California is going in the wrong direction with its cap and trade and is following the same mistakes that Europe made when they set up a cap and trade system. I wonder if you could respond to that. Should we be putting a price on these allowances, or should we just be giving them away without any kind of option?
I don't think it's either or. I think you have to. I think we are learning from the mistakes that were made in Europe, and we're learning from some of the things that Reggie has done in the energy sector. And there's no question that we have to start out with a very heavy dose of allowances and a very small price in order to ramp up in a way that does not create economic shock, and so that we can adjust as things get to what's happening in the market. So I think we will end up getting to a more of a we'll start out with a higher allocation, with a higher amount of allowances, and we will end up with a higher price ramped up over time as the industries can absorb it. But I think it's not either or. We're starting at a low cost, at a high allowance, and then we'll be ramping up over time and adjusting as needed based upon the market response.
Mm-hmm. And isn't there a potential for certain industries to game the system?
Absolutely, which is why you want to start out slow and you want to have the mechanisms in place to make adjustments. If you think you know the answer and you put it into place and you lock it into place and you can't adjust, people are going to game it, and industries are going to game it, companies are going to game it, and you need to be able to be nimble. So you got to start out. We will be criticized by those who want us to be more aggressive on the price and those who want to be more aggressive on auctioning. But it's a mistake to start out with too rigid a formula, because it'll end up costing you the entire policy.
So AB 32 did not even mandate cap and trade. Why not another system? Why not a carbon tax?
Well, I don't think a carbon tax was part of the discussion, and that would require that's an entirely different approach. Carbon tax is an entirely different approach than what AB 32 set, the course that we were set on. Remember, the cap and trade is the balancer. The vast majority of AB 32 uses the same framework that was used with the acid rain framework that was put in place a couple of decades ago, where you have a regulatory framework and you have market incentives, and that's what AB 32 is. The cap and trade program is the balancer. It's about 20% of the carbon emissions are expected to come from that. It's not designed to be the centerpiece of the policy. A carbon tax would be economy-wide, and it would have to be the centerpiece of climate change policy. So I think that's I'm not prepared to debate which one is better than the other. We set on one course, and we have to make it work.
Jack, as Susan mentioned, cap and trade is a market-based approach to trying to reduce emissions, different than traditional command and control, set regulations, tell your industry to reduce emissions. So is your industry, your association, supportive of cap and trade?
We've been trying to support cap and trade, that's right. And our problem with, again, as Susan said, is the uncertainty of what the costs are going to be as we move forward here. If we do the free allocation and the large allocation here in the short term, then we're going to ratchet that down in 3 years, and that's not very conducive to investment policy, not knowing what the cost is going to be in 3 years. And I come back to that issue again. If we're going to grow the wealth creative sector of our economy, we have to have some certainty going into the future, and not allow the leakage that is apt to happen as costs escalate and you lose businesses to other states and other nations. I mean, I think the green tech industry is a perfect example of that. We had high hopes of seeing windmill and solar manufacturing blooming in California. Unfortunately, what's happened is we're seeing that happen in China and in other places. So I think we have to figure out how we're going to make this happen. But when California goes it alone, and that's the problem here. When California's going it alone, it's largely symbolic. And at the same time, and I don't disagree that the citizens of California want to have a clean economy. I mean, a clean environment. We've always been the leaders there. The question right now is with our recession in such a hole right now, and our jobless rate so high, what signals are we sending to the investors who would otherwise be investing in California in new plants and equipment?
I'm sorry, but a lot of that is, I'm not allowed to curse on TV, so I love you, Jack. But we have permitted more than 4,000 megawatts of solar energy in this year alone in California. Compare that. That's almost 10% of our grid. That is, and by the first half of next year, we will have probably 7,000 megawatts of renewable energy permitted in California. It's unheard of in the world in terms of investment. That is coming from the consistency of our AB 32 policy, our climate change policies, in spite of the economy. And so I think it's a absolutely, this idea that California is going it alone is just horseshit. Excuse me. It is. When you're a leader, you're alone at the front. But you're in the vanguard, and we were alone when we did the emissions regulation back in the middle of the 1990s, and the U.S. EPA has adopted it, and it's now national policy. So it's lonely being a leader, but the idea that this concept that California is going it alone is off base. We are leading, is what we're doing.
Well, we have AB 32 alone. We're not alone in the creation of green technology and in doing renewables. As Susan said earlier, many states already have renewable portfolio standards, and states like Texas are ahead of us in some of those areas, without AB 32 and without the additional cost. And much of the growth in renewables in California has rested on the fact that the federal government has done large subsidies of those installations in order to get them up and make them viable. And I'm not sure that as we go down the road here in the next year or two, we're going to see those large subsidies continuing.
So Ted, what's your view on this? Do you?
Which words do I get to use?
Yeah. I think everything's on the table now.
Everything's on the table. Okay. Again, I probably like to look at it a little bit more from the fact-based elements. There is no doubt we have a significant amount of renewable development in the state. Our company, another part of our company, does renewables development all throughout the United States. We're in fact in 14 states doing renewables development. The truth of it is subsidized. The truth of it is expensive relative to other forms of energy. So probably it wouldn't occur on a straight up economic choice basis if you were going low-cost development. So if you're going to choose between coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, whatever, string them all out and look at which one is the lowest cost, taking into account you can't create all of your electricity from one single source. That would be dangerous. But the renewables are at the high end of that. So okay, that's a fact. It's also creating a lot of innovation. It's also stimulating new businesses. It is adding a different dimension into the energy mix. It's doing important things from a national energy security standpoint. So they're just relative pluses and minuses, and there are costs associated. Without the mandates, be they state or in some regards federal, and without the federal tax subsidies, they probably would not be the generation source of choice on a straight economic basis. Okay, so those are the facts. I'm not sure how much people understand exactly what those facts are and what the cost trade-offs are associated with it. So I don't know, maybe I've definitely placed myself somewhere in the middle between Jack and Susan on this, but I just think those are the realities. And when we're trying to figure out how to integrate all of these activities into a very complicated, in terms of physics, a complicated system, the electric grid, we have to do a number of things to make it all work. We can make just about anything work. It's just what are the trade-offs with the cost and reliability of the system.
Mm-hmm. So Rebecca, I wanted to talk about the subject of adaptation. Do you feel like there's any real focus on this issue? I mean, there's a lot of attention in California on green tech and clean tech. And yet scientists say that we're already seeing some effects of global climate change, and in the next, potentially in just the next few years, 10 years, 20 years, we could see some dramatic effects on the Sierra Nevada, on rainfall patterns. Do you feel like this issue is getting the kind of public attention it deserves?
No. It is the.
That was a softball.
Yeah, exactly.
I gave her a hard one
Thank you
earlier.
very much. It is the poor stepsister of climate policy, but and one that was not addressed in any significant way for a long, long time. And in fact, it wasn't until the 2007 IPCC report came out that stated that all the scientific evidence was showing that even if we cut greenhouse gas emissions today, in 2007, we were committed to substantial changes in temperatures and precipitations that would have impacts on our water supplies, on our precipitation patterns, and therefore flooding, fire, and sea level rise. And that we were going to need to pay attention to it in a sort of systematic way. That conversation then started around 2007, but the dominant conversation has still been in the last 3 years around, I think rightfully so, around greenhouse gas emissions reductions, because if you don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions reductions, no adaptation measures you put in place, you don't get those reductions, no adaptation measures you put in place are going to matter. But we do have to understand what we've committed ourselves to in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, what the impacts are going to be on the climate, what the subsequent impacts are going to be on our communities and our public safety. That there are, just like California has taken the leadership to tackle greenhouse gas emissions, our local communities, these climate impacts are going to be local, and our local communities are taking the lead on adaptation. They're not waiting. The state did a really nice job of pulling together a statewide adaptation strategy. It was one of the first in the nation. I was on a climate change adaptation task force with the Pacific Council, which developed a set of, through a report, developed a set of recommendations, including developing a climate risk center to give local communities the information they need to make good decisions based on the kind of impacts we're likely to see. And those impacts are sea level rise. What are our communities going to do when we hit that projected 55 inches of sea level rise by the year 2070? I mean, these are things that we need to start taking, we need to start addressing and understand today what we need to do, even in the down economy, low-cost measures today to prepare ourselves for the long-term inevitabilities.
Well, but what does that mean? Does that mean moving Sacramento out of the floodplain? Does it mean changing San Francisco, which is projected to be large parts of it being inundated by rising sea levels? I mean, what does adaptation mean?
And I think this is why getting information through a climate risk council that could be supported by the state of California, getting the information to the local governments so that they can understand what that means for their own communities and begin to make the decisions for how they're going to adapt to the inevitable impacts. In many places, it's going to mean hardscaping, so sea level, seawalls and levees to protect our infrastructure. For long term, it's going to mean planning differently. It's going to mean that our regional planning entities will be focused not just on greenhouse gas emission reductions through vehicle miles traveled, but also how do you protect the communities that are there? How do you keep them out of harm's way from sea level rise, from flooding events, or from fire? And I think that this is not new. This kind of thinking is not new. It's just that the adaptation actually and the climate change, the knowledge of climate change impacts actually inspires a more integrated way of planning at the local and regional level. And I think the local governments are ready to do that. They just need the kind of climate risk information that something like a climate risk council would give them to do that. And we can learn by allowing communities to take the lead, we can learn from their leadership and understand better how we should be promoting adaptation across the state in places that don't have resources or the expertise to do it.
Yeah. So I wanted to save time for questions from the audience. If there's anybody that has one right now, we'll certainly entertain it. If not, I've got a few more. But does anybody, Ellen?
Let's talk loud. So I was intrigued early in the panel, seeing that there was some consensus among you that there's a potential to go forward while also lowering the costs of energy. And that means cleaner energy, I guess, but also maybe cheaper energy. And I would love to hear a little bit more if there are some examples of what we could do along those lines.
Who would like to tackle that?
I'll take a run at it. I think you have to be a little careful about that. That sounds almost a little too good to be true, and at least typically when I hear something that sounds too good to be true, it usually is. I think the one area where we do have a bit of a snarl right now, and I think actually Susan maybe mentioned it, we do have a number of pieces of legislation and regulation that have been developed essentially, I'll say, in response to the energy crisis days. And some of those things no longer really work in an integrated way. They actually work against each other. And I think that there's a friction cost, if I can put it that way, associated with those when you have competing regulations or things that really don't work in an integrated way. As we sometimes say at Edison, there's a difference between the legislated or administrated system and the physical electric system. It is a highly engineered system. So when you make changes to it, you are going to create inefficiencies in the engineered system, which can be costly. Some examples I could give real quickly would be once-through cooling is really an effort to try to reduce, if not eliminate, the potential for marine life damage, as well as thermal discharge from electric generation that's near water bodies, where they take water in and cool down the plant and then send it back out into the ocean. So that's a laudable goal. We want to try to do things to improve that. But that's happening at the same time that we are trying to dramatically increase the amount of renewables that are in the system, up to 33%. That means there's a lot more intermittent resource that has to be managed into the electric system. The major way we do that today is by having a switch on a generation plant that we can control, as opposed to Mother Nature controlling sun and wind output. If we get rid of all the once-through cooling plants that currently exist today, then we are going to have to replace it with something that allows us to deal with the intermittency from the increased use of renewables. Those are two things that are just, they're good on an independent basis, but when you throw them together, it creates a lot of friction in the system, which is costly. So I think that's one main area that would come to mind. There are other examples, but that would be one.
Can I build on that? I mean, that was a really good example. The biggest problem we have in California is that there is no integrated planning. So, I mean, Department of Fish and Game has probably a bigger impact on the price of electricity than the Energy Commission does. Because depending on how many tortoises you have to move, when you build this plant, it's going to raise the cost of the electricity coming out of that facility. Yet there's no planning for habitat development in the state where you're going to build transmission. We started that 2.5 years ago for the first time in California, planning for where you can build transmission lines, where the habitat needs to be for endangered species, so that we can plan for the development of some of these renewable facilities. So that kind of integrated planning is critical. The once-through cooling is a great example. When this first came up, when it first came to my attention, the independent system operator talked to the State Water Resources Control Board members. I'll leave names out. And the ISO said to the Water Board, if you go through with your once-through cooling policy the way that you're developing this right now, you're going to take 1/3 of the electricity in California offline. 1/3 will go offline if you implement this regulation the way it's drafted. The response from the Water Board member was, not my problem. Because that's not their focal point is water. Their focal point is what comes out of the emissions into the water and how it hurts the environment at the end of that pipe. They're not even forced to be at the same table to think about what it means in terms of our electricity, our grid. our energy security. And one of the things that Governor Schwarzenegger has tried to do for the last couple of years is put an energy department in place that integrates many of we have like 13 different entities that either touch or directly impact our energy planning in California, yet we don't have one central planning which can even begin to integrate our policy needs, let alone our try and deal with some of the overlapping regulations that make it really hard for him to do business in the state. We need to, energy is too major, and we need to integrate our policy making body so that we have the planning capability and we can eliminate the overlapping
and I just want to agree with that. This tangled mess of regulations we have, and this is a perfect example here, where you're seeing, government now at the highest level, with the governor getting personally involved with trying to weed his way through some of these regulations. We have environmental regulations and policies in place in this state that companies cannot maneuver their way through. I just met a fellow a couple of weeks ago from a CEO of a company called Blue Fire Energy. They're going to make cellulosic ethanol in California. That was their plan. They're based in Irvine. The plan was to build a plant out in the Lancaster area. They spent 2 years and $9 million trying to get a permit, finally just said it's not going to happen here, moved their plans to Mississippi, and had a plant up breaking ground in 9 months with $3 million permitting fees. It just costs, in California, anything can be stopped for any length of time if there's desire to do so.
Okay.
That's right.
So we have a number of questions from the audience. Panel, please keep your answers short so we can get to all of them. The gentleman in the blue shirt, please identify yourself.
Okay, thank you. I'm John Bozell, CEO of CalStart. We're an organization that represents clean transportation technology companies, many of which we think will benefit from AB 32 implementation and will grow and prosper in California. I do think some of these permitting issues do need to be addressed even to see those companies grow as well. I think a really important point the panel has made is that the cap and trade is a small percentage of the overall AB 32 program, and we are making a lot of progress under that effort. When you include refiners in the transportation equation, transportation represents 50% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions from California. So I think it's critical that we address the transportation sector. Cap and trade really does seem to be narrowly guided toward increasing rates to make changes in the electricity sector, which we already recognized is relatively clean and low carbon. So my question is really made to Stuart and to the left side of the panel. Is there an opportunity here to say maybe create a blue ribbon commission, look at a transportation system that is very underfunded? We've still got congestion is a big problem in California. Can we look at somehow creating some kind of carbon fee on gasoline, which maybe could even make these manufacturers even more competitive by not raising their electricity rates?
Yeah, I'll trade a blue ribbon commission for holding off the low carbon fuel standards for a while. Sounds like a fair trade. No, I mean I think it's a serious question, and the fact is we have a lot of carbon emitted out of our transportation. The question is how do we get there? I mean we have a standard in place now that CARB has approved, but really there's a very, very weak road to getting there. How we're going to get there? I mean, we need to reduce 10% of our carbon intensity in our gasoline. The question is how does that happen? How are we going to do that? Yeah. I don't think we know that right now.
And I would have to challenge you a little bit. I mean, gas prices went up to nearly $4 a gallon in, 2006, 2007. How much did that change behavior? How high a carbon fee would you have to put on the transportation sector in order to actually reduce carbon? I mean, I don't think you can. I don't think that's the answer in that sector. And there's also, we often confuse our climate change, our greenhouse gas emissions issues when it comes to the transportation sector with our air quality regulations that have been in place for decades now. The regulations for particulate matter and SOx emission, things like that, that's what's affecting us today. That's what's affecting us in terms of the trucking sector and a lot of these sectors. It's not the greenhouse gas emissions that haven't even gone into effect yet. And they are extremely expensive to implement and very, very difficult, especially in this economy. So I would say that California is approaching this properly, and that I don't think a carbon tax is the answer in the transportation sector. I think that it has to be a small, gradually increased part of any overall policy, but it has to start with the regulatory framework of reducing carbon emissions the way we're doing it with the low carbon fuel standard.
So Susan commutes a lot to Marin County, so she doesn't want a tax on gasoline.
Hey, that's crap. I pay my gas just like everybody else does. I contribute more than you do. You bicycle to work. I contribute to the economy a lot more than you do.
Is there a beep button on
She's on my side now.
Good afternoon.
That's why they sit next to each other.
No. Good afternoon.
It's as imperative that the oceans are rising as that we won't be here to manage the system. And I don't see resonating from the morning session what strategic commitment is being made to our children to make sure that they are the public that knows, because there's no way that we can educate the voting public in the way that we can educate our children to be the new landlords of the planet. That agenda seems to me to be so profound and so pervasive and so essential that those of you that are working at the nuts and bolts and figuring out these mechanisms, there has to be a way for you to make a serious commitment to what is happening in our school system to make sure that our children can lead in the way that they have to lead to transform life. Would you comment on that?
I would.
Go ahead.
No,
Go right
I
ahead.
just,
I'll let you have this one.
no, I just want to point. I think it's really important that you can't decouple mitigation and adaptation. Like they're inextricably linked. You got to do one. You got to do the other. And I think adaptation is a critical piece of the mitigation puzzle and how you get that done. Adaptation is local. The impacts are going to be local. The adaptation plans and the investment in adaptation has got to be local as well. When you're looking to develop adaptation plans at a local level, you understand the impacts and you understand how climate change is going to impact your local community, and you can begin to make decisions about how you're going to move into the next century for your children. What is your local community to look like? And that begins to build support for further reduction in greenhouse gas emissions once you understand at a local level what the impacts are going to be in your backyard. So I agree with you that the children need to know, but I think that the adults that are determining today what our communities will look like in 50 years need to start taking that kind of information into account.
Children will tell the adults what to do. They understand better than the adults and are not constrained by the kinds of things that constrain us.
No, and I agree. And my son.
There has to be a war made on this transformation of our children immediately. They are the hope and the only solution. Truly.
I agree.
Other questions from the audience? Yep.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Evelyn Rangel Medina with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and I wanted to ask a question about climate change. And like research demonstrates that climate change will magnify all existing inequalities. So what are the holistic policy solutions we can pursue to ensure that the most vulnerable of our citizens, of our community members, are protected? That's the elderly, low-income people, people of color, people who are at the margins of the economy now, to ensure that they're integrated into the economy and that we do protect them with the policies we pursue.
It's an interesting question.
I'm going to let Jack answer.
This is your opportunity.
I would just say is creating the climate for economic growth. I mean that's what creates jobs for people at all levels of society. And if you don't have growth in jobs and a growing economy, the people that get hurt are the people at the very lowest rungs.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. But I would add that regardless of that, we have low-income communities in the state that already are affected by heat waves. You know, in Sacramento a few years ago, we had several people who died in a hotel. So it's a legitimate question, you know, are we as a state organized to try to make sure that in adapting that disadvantaged communities are being taken care of, being protected?
Can I be the naysayer here?
Yeah.
Climate change is not an issue that affects poor communities any more than wealthy communities. If you want to look at the impact of climate change, look at the multi-billion-dollar homes down in San Diego that got wiped out because our entire hydrology of the state is changing. The floodplains are changing and are changing the hydrology of the state, the water supply. There's a lot of issues. I think what Jack said about the economy and our investment in jobs, the cost of electricity is probably more impactful on poor communities than anything else. But let's not just confuse climate change policy with the social justice policies of, say, air quality. Like air quality is that's an area that where it concentrates in poor areas where you have either dirty energy or manufacturing or not clean water supplies, things like that. But I don't think climate change is an issue that translates well into poor communities. Carbon doesn't collect. Sorry.
Other questions?
Noel Perry, my question is for Susan and for the rest of the panel. As Governor Brown plans to come into office in the next month, what advice would you offer to Governor Brown regarding AB 32? What concerns do you have, and what are the fears that one might have about AB 32 and its continued implementation?
Yeah, good question. We only have a few minutes, so let's keep our answers short. Ted, you want to start?
I thought he said Susan. It is a great question. I guess I'd probably use it to reemphasize a couple of themes that I tried to make in my earlier comments. Be fact-based, be thoughtful. We need to be careful in how we take advantage of this opportunity to really be an example to the country, perhaps the world, and really be mindful of the fact that you can end up with a lot of layers of competing initiatives, competing goals that end up making it more difficult to actually manage the system in a reliable and affordable manner.
Rebecca, you want to say something briefly? No.
Yeah. Just moving forward, I really do think we need to make a more concerted effort. I mean, I don't think the issues about a disaggregated planning that happen on the electrical side are the same on sort of the land use side and the resource side, and that the extent that we use existing planning efforts or existing regulations, take a hard look at them and how they need to change to help facilitate some of our long-term goals, both in mitigation and adaptation, that will be more successful on both. And then also just the last plea that we look at the two in concert and we really understand the interplay between mitigation and adaptation so that we don't make long-term costly mistakes on either.
So Jack, your advice to the governor briefly.
Take all of my advice, first of all, but no, I really, I mean, from an economic standpoint and from the state standpoint, the only way we're going to get out of this $25 billion long-term budget crisis we're in is to have a dynamic, growing economy. Right now, we're kind of bouncing along the bottom. I think it needs something dramatic to kickstart our economy. That's why, at my association, the manufacturers, we've looked at regulatory reform. It's a low-cost item for the state. It's not like tax incentives or other giveaways. It's something you can do very cost-effectively. And the governor has talked a lot about regulatory reform in the jumbled, over-regulated economy of California. So I think that's my message to him. Is let's look at this vast amount of regulations, see what we can do to streamline it. And another critical piece of this is the legislature taking some responsibility for oversight on what's going on in some of the regulatory agencies. And I've been around state government for a few years, and I can recall a time when the budget subcommittees actually took department heads and agency secretaries apart on issues. We hardly see any of that oversight going on, at least on any kind of systemic process there.
Susan, your advice to the governor-elect?
I think he's approaching this issue exactly the right way. As Attorney General, he's been very, very strongly supportive of strong, clear, aggressive goals. the approach being slow, cautious, very careful about its impact on the economy, and he has talked about regulatory reform. He's actually made it a point. As mayor of Oakland, he learned firsthand what it means when the rubber hits the road and you have to get something built or you have to get a business to come to your area. And so he's focused, he knows exactly where to focus on the kind of regulatory reform that will help keep our economy going, move it, kick it back into high gear. And that's where he needs to focus. That's where the real challenge is going to be based upon what we just discussed. And I think the governor's focused on the right thing.
Nice things about Jerry Brown.
Surprise you?
Are you looking for a job?
I don't need to be looking for a job. I don't need to be looking for a job to be complimentary. This has been a very smooth transition.
Ellen?
Well, thank you very much, and I think everyone in the group can join me in a great round of applause for this really excellent panel. So I'm coming away feeling actually some real cause for hope here, because I think everyone on the panel agrees that there's a need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels for the health of the state and the planet. Some disagreements about some of the timing and some of the mechanisms, but an agreement that there's a need to look at some of these trade-offs between the economy and the environmental goals and find ways to meet that happy middle by addressing some of the regulatory obstacles. And I think that sounds like a really workable plan for going forward.